Last week I started talking about Intarsia, and I'm finishing up this week. This was the same design I was doing last week, and if you remember, I held my yarn tails to the front, great tip, so that you don't mix them up and use them instead of the working yarn. And I've always found diagonal lines easier to do. The tension just seems to work out better. But on rows, where you're creating a straight vertical edge, it's more difficult. And let's review how to do Intarsia first, and then we'll talk about how to kind of fix those edges. Remember, when I change colors, and George is taking a nap, so we will not see him today. I'm always going to be taking my new yarn from the bottom and to the right to cross it, so that I have these joins. See how the yellow yarn is going to catch, and it's going to create a non-hole if you do that. If you don't do that, you're going to wind up with a hole. Now, one of the things that can happen when you're starting a new row is if I pull this very, very tight, it's going to make this stitch small. And I don't want to make it any smaller than it's going to be naturally. So I want to use my needle tips. And the other thing I want to do is I want to, instead of moving that up to the tip of the needle where it can become even smaller, I'm going to kind of keep it down on my needle where it's wider. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to work that stitch and then slide it off. And the tendency is right here to pull really tight. Well, that's going to do two things. It's going to make this stitch smaller, and it's going to pull yarn from that stitch over there. So I don't want to do that. Where I want to tighten up a bit is on the second stitch in. And by the way, doing all of these things still is no guarantee that it's going to be perfect. We'll talk about it another way. Well, here's my last stitch, and again, I'm going to try not to distort it too much and use my needle tips, and I'm going to bring my new color under and to the right, and the same applies. I'm going to pull this guy over, and I'm going to try, when I get to my second stitch, that's where I'm going to pull a little tighter. Now let's look on my right side, and you can see this still isn't perfect. Now another thing that I can try, and I do this on oversized selvage stitches, is wrap. When I get to my new color, insert my needle in there, and again I'm taking it from the bottom and to the right. Normally when I work a knit stitch, I pull the yarn from under the stitch, under. If I take it from the top, it's going to reduce the amount of yarn I'm using in that stitch and make it a little smaller. Now if you do that, you got to remember that you work that stitch to the back on the next row. Work this guy, and then do the same on this one. Under and over. And that's going to make them a little smaller. Okay, and then when I work that next row, I'll work one more row and then we'll look at the completed thing. I'm going to have to remember that that stitch is twisted on my needle, and if I work it like this, it's going to twist it. So I need to work it through the back. That was a stitch I wrapped the wrong way on the other side. And here's this one. Again, I didn't bother to do any kind of yarn management on this because I'm lazy. What can I say? And I'm not knitting a very big piece, so I'm not worrying about it too much. And I'm going to just snug this guy up and go on under and to the right. That's your mantra when you're doing Intarsia, under and to the right. Alright, and that's a stitch that was twisted, so I'm going to work it through the back and then under and to the right with this one. Now, before you weave in any yarn tails on Intarsia, and this is an important thing to keep in mind, check the front of the work and see how it looks. And it may be that you can do some adjustments. Now when I look at this, if I have some overlarge stitches, I can use a tapestry needle or some other method to tinker with it. Get some of that excess yarn in here and work it through to the center of the design. The other thing I can do is if I have some overlarge stitches right here is I can work them just right to the yarn tail. Now when I'm finished, first thing I got to do is I have to pull those yarn tails through to the wrong side because I don't want them there. And I want to make sure that I don't twist them up or take them over a stitch on the right side. And actually using a crochet hook would be better for this, but I don't have one handy, so I'm not using it. Now I'm not going to take the time to weave this in because I have done a ton of videos on how to weave in yarn tails, and this is the same. But the thing that I need to do is to remember, how do I weave it in? Now this stitch, if I had continued to use this yarn, it would have gone in that direction. So when I weave in the yarn tails, I want to take it in that direction. And what that's going to do is it's going to close up the hole there. Now before I weave it in, I want to look at the right side and see that the stitch is a big size. If I pull it too tight, the stitch completely disappears. If it's too loose, I want it to look, you know, like Goldilocks, just right. Now this yarn, if I had continued to use it, pull it all the way through, it would have gone in this direction as well. So I would want to duplicate stitch both of those ends in this direction. If I duplicate stitch them the other way, I'm going to get a hole. What I do not want to do is twist them and wrap them because that's just going to make a big old clunky spot. And I weave them in, and that's pretty much how it's going to look.